Hi, my name is Richard Medhurst, and I've just finished covering the Assange hearing at the Royal Courts of Justice in London, and today was a win for Julian. So I'm going to tell you what happened in court and go through my thread, which I was live tweeting as the hearing was unfolding. So basically, this was about whether the High Court wanted to give Julian permission to go and appeal the assurances provided by the Americans, right? Because the whole case right now is about assurances. It's not about freedom of the press. It's not about his health. It's about the assurances. Now, obviously, in the assurances, they deal with these matters, but nevertheless, we have to understand what the argument is here. It's the Americans trying to prove to the British judicial system that they can be trusted, that they will treat Julian fairly, and so on. And today, they failed to demonstrate that. So the judges were unsatisfied with the assurances provided by the Americans, and they gave Julian limited leave to appeal. So originally, his legal team had applied on about 9 different counts, and they were awarded 4 and 5 to appeal on. Now, 4 deals with the lack of free speech, the violation of Article 10 under the European Convention on Human Rights. You could say it's a sort of equivalent to the First Amendment in America. Not exactly, and you'll see why in a moment. But the argument is that you can't send him there if you don't promise to if you don't guarantee him his free speech, right? This is a pillar of European law, of British law. You can't treat him unfairly. And now ground 5, the other reason, is that the judges felt Julian would be prejudiced at trial because of his nationality. So because he is not a US citizen, they would treat him unfairly. And that actually relates to the free speech question, because the Americans are arguing, well, you're not an American citizen, so you don't really have free speech, which is ridiculous because they're also saying you're not an American citizen, but you can be punished by US law, but you get none of the nice things under US law, right? So Julian was not there today, right? We've seen him most of the hearings, but he didn't appear today or back in February because he was sick. He's not feeling well. He's literally physically being killed by the Americans. You know, this is what's at stake. They're slowly killing him, so he didn't appear. And we first had Edward Fitzgerald, so he's part of Julian's team, and he argued that, look, even if the U.S. prosecutor, who's called Kronberg, even if he comes and offers an assurance, it's not a guarantee. It's not a real guarantee, because once Julian is in America, the U.S. trial courts can say, well, we don't care what this guy promised you. We are deciding to do this and this, right? So whatever assurance is given by the U.S. prosecutor doesn't actually hold up in an American court, which is really funny. And on top of that, even though we know that the assurance is empty, he didn't even bother giving one, right? So that's what Fitzgerald was pointing out. It's that the assurances are garbage, and they didn't even bother giving them, even though we know they're garbage. And so Julian has effectively zero guarantee of being given First Amendment rights once he's in the US, which would effectively violate his right to free speech under Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, Fitzgerald then explains if Kronberg, he gives any sort of assurance, or we have the State Department providing diplomatic assurances. Well, yes, of course, the U.S. courts will take them into consideration, but that doesn't actually mean anything, right? These are just weasel words. And so you can't argue that the First Amendment assurance, even if they want to give it, which they don't, would be binding, when the Americans themselves are saying, well, we can just change the meaning of the assurance. You can't expect the trial court to obey what the State Department says. So in any case, there's a real risk to Julian being discriminated against at trial precisely because of his foreign citizenship. Precisely because he is not an American, he will therefore have no rights. So, you get all the bad but none of the good. And therefore the court received no valid assurances from the Americans. They failed to satisfy the requirements of the court. Now we have Mark Summers who takes over from Fitzgerald, so they're both from Julian's legal team. And then we had him talking about how, Section 81B of the Extradition Act basically spells this out very clearly. It says that if extradited, so this is barred, right? Extradition is barred if the person extradited might be prejudiced at his trial, or punished, detained, or restricted in his personal liberty by reason of his race, religion, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, or political opinions. So we have 2 things being violated here, essentially, because they're targeting Julian because of his political opinions and because of his nationality. And so the Americans, again, this is what Julian's team are pointing out. They're saying the Americans, they claim this protection does not apply to Assange, right? This protection under British law, which precludes you from extradition because you're being discriminated against. The Americans say, no, it doesn't apply. And it won't even come up during trial, right? And in the scenario that Julian would not be able to rely on First Amendment protections, that would just be one factor, his nationality. And then they start arguing, right? The Americans want to argue essentially that nationality and citizenship are two different things, which is, it's so American, right? Like they'll then start picking words apart and splitting hairs and making up new things. And so, Mark Summers said, look, if you want to debate nationality versus citizenship, you should have brought this up during the last 4 years, right? You never brought this up. This is like you're introducing new arguments right now. And so, this is just, he says this is plain wrong to make the argument that nationality and citizenship are different. UK citizenship is one of many ways of being a national. The two are inextricable. And so Mark Summers goes on to say that the US, when they claim that, Julian Assange would be denied his First Amendment rights, only partially because of nationality, right? So it's not discrimination. It's just a little bit because of nationality. Well, that's still a very important factor. You can't just disregard that, right? And so then we had the Americans talking. So we heard from Julian's team. Now we have the Americans taking over. Now we have James Lewis, who suddenly reappears. He was missing for the last couple of hearings, and he's really a character. Okay, so he's the top prosecutor for the Americans in this case, and he says that under Section 81B of the Extradition Act and how it precludes extradition if we know that you'll be discriminated against. Well, he goes on to make this amazing argument. He says that in the past, you had UK residents who were sent to Guantanamo Bay, okay, and mistreated there. They were tortured, obviously, and so the UK Foreign Ministry was then taken to court because of this, and he was basically saying that, yeah, okay, they were tortured, but they're not UK nationals, so you can't come in and say a resident is the same thing as a national. And his point is that, look, Julian Assange is not an American, so how can you come in and say he has American rights? Just like we tortured those UK residents, we're going to do it to him. So, it was like basically the Americans admitting that they tortured people in Guantanamo Bay just so they could get the point across that it's okay to deprive Julian Assange of his First Amendment rights because he's not an American. It's really amazing, the mental gymnastics. He was really fully into it. And so he goes on to say that Section 81B, it discriminates people from being, it precludes people from being discriminated against at trial, and it's an anti-discrimination clause, and it pertains to fair trial issues, which is right. But he then says that, this doesn't apply to Julian, which is wrong. It's really clearly wrong. And so he says that the assurances provided by the Americans, they're restricted, so they don't go all the way. Remember, the Americans are playing weasel words. They don't actually say that Julian Assange will be granted First Amendment rights at trial. They say Julian Assange will have the possibility to raise First Amendment rights at trial, and he may be granted them, which is basically a non-assurance. This is not an assurance or a guarantee. This is you telling me that you're not going to guarantee it. So there you go. He goes on, James Lewis goes on to make the case that, well, no, it's restricted partially because he's not an American citizen. We have to do it like this, a bunch of nonsense. That it's not discriminatory, blah, blah, blah. And so he even raises the case of Chelsea Manning. So she's the one who actually gave these documents to Julian Assange. So she blew the whistle on these US war crimes. And he says, well, look, when she was court-martialed, she was also deprived of raising her First Amendment rights at trial, or having them taken into consideration. And she's an American citizen. And he says you can't use the First Amendment to shield criminality, right? So he then thanks the court essentially for making up new categories, which is what they did in the March 26th ruling. So category 1 is about complicity, how Julian Assange is allegedly complicit in Chelsea Manning's obtaining of the documents. So that's count 1, 3 to 14, and then 18. And then we have category 2, okay? So this is conspiring with hackers. And then we have category 3, which is naming human sources. This was such a funny moment because it was basically, it looked like the US prosecution collaborating with the British judicial system, which is really not that, far-fetched, is it? Otherwise, Julian wouldn't be in jail. in any case, afterwards we heard enough from the Americans. Now we had Ben Watson come on, and Ben Watson is the lawyer for the Home Secretary, right? So the Secretary of State, basically our Interior Ministry in the UK. And remember that the appeal here is not just against the Americans and their assurances; it's against the Home Secretary, because she has, she abdicated her duty to preclude Julian from extradition because he will likely be given the death penalty, because he will be prejudiced, right? So she abdicated her duty, and that's why her lawyer is now coming in and telling the court today that, they find the assurances satisfactory, they believe the Americans, and they think that the court should accept the assurances, which they didn't. So then we had Mark Summers come back for Julian's defense, and he basically said that, look, you can't come in like James Lewis is doing, and then say it's okay to violate people's rights under certain conditions. The protection is an absolute. That's why it's a protection, right? If Assange should be, discriminated against at trial, well, guess what? The extradition is barred, full stop. And then he says that, Chelsea Manning, when you're talking about how, well, she was deprived of her First Amendment rights, so it's okay to do it to Julian Assange, that's not an argument. Chelsea Manning is a soldier. She signed a contract that binds her to government secrecy. Julian Assange is not from America. He's never lived in America. He doesn't work for any government agency. He's never signed a non-disclosure agreement. He's not bound by any secrecy laws. This is ridiculous. How are you comparing a journalist to someone being court-martialed? So that was the argument being made by Mark Summers. He was basically responding to James Lewis. And so he also says that, look, Julian Assange is going to be held in America, right? The trial will take place while he's held at ADX Florence in Virginia. And so even though he would be in America, in the United States during the trial, the courts will still seek to deny him First Amendment protections. And they've done this to foreign nationals in the past. So we've seen in previous cases how foreign nationals are discriminated against once they arrive in America. The courts, they only care about where the conduct or the alleged crime of journalism took place. Whether it was inside or outside the United States of America. And so whether, Julian Assange happens to be physically located within the US during the trial bears absolutely, no weight whatsoever on the case. And so, Mark Summers, he refers to the lower court's decision, Judge Vanessa Barretzer, and he points out how she confused the First Amendment in the United States with the Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, which is incorporated into British law as well. So both of them deal with free speech, but apparently they're not equal. Why? Because Julian Assange is not a European, he's an Australian, and nevertheless he is still protected by Article 10. Whereas in America, with the First Amendment, they're saying you don't get protections. You have to be an American to get First Amendment protection. So you can't come in and say, well, as long as the Americans promise that Julian Assange will have First Amendment rights, we can ship him off to America and he'll be in good hands. You can't say that. The judge was wrong to say that, because First Amendment rights will not be given to Julian. He will be discriminated against. And this is not equal to the ironclad protections that we have in the UK and Europe, supposedly. Right? So that's the argument he's trying to make. And it's a very solid one. It's very true. How far they apply in Europe is a different matter. But certainly in this case, Julian Assange is not British. He's not European. And nevertheless, he gets all the protections of someone who's a resident inside a Council of Europe country or the UK. Right? So it's very different. It's much better than in America. And so, Mark Summers, he goes on to address the arguments made by US lawyers about Julian's citizenship, and he says, look, there's no legal basis for you to come in and discriminate against him just because he's not an American, right? All the arguments you said thus far have nothing to do with this case. It's just gibberish. And so, whether you want to play games about nationality versus citizenship, are they the same thing? Well, you can go and do that in your own time. The discrimination is still there because Julian is not a US national and he's not a US citizen. So what difference does it make? You're still discriminating against him because of these things. And so, that whether you're partially denying him First Amendment rights on that basis, it's still discrimination. So, Mark Summers also points out that all these expert witnesses that we heard from, when we were covering the case in London at the Old Bailey, in the lower court, which went on for weeks. So 40 expert witnesses that came in and testified for Assange, which goes to show how much, this persecution is ridiculous. Well, in any case, today what happened is Mark Summers referred back to that time and he said, look, you've got tons of experts who came in the court and told the judge, this case against Julian I mean, it shouldn't even be happening, because this is simply journalism. It's protected under any jurisdiction, right? British, American, European. It's perfectly legal. There's nothing wrong here. On the contrary, you are breaking the law. You're the one that is not only violating his free speech rights and his human rights, but also everybody else's by criminalizing journalism. And so, you know, he basically says, he goes on to say afterwards that that Julian has to be protected, you know, regardless. He has a right to free speech. And when he's in America, that right will absolutely disappear and evaporate. And so therefore you cannot extradite him. You have to bar the extradition. And so Mark Summers goes on to point out that, you know, if the High Court agree with the lower court, which they do, that the solution here is to have the Americans come in and say, we promise to give Julian Assange First Amendment rights. Well, then get the Americans to grant the assurances. Okay? If that's the solution, because both courts, the lower and the higher, say just give him Julian First Amendment rights, then get the Americans to give the assurances, because they haven't given them thus far. And if they don't want to give them, well, then bar the extradition and free the man. Right? So pick one of them. And then we had, you know, we had Fitzgerald, who took over from Summers, and you know, Lewis was moaning for a bit and saying, "Oh, well, you can't have all these people talking." You know, basically he was complaining that you have too many lawyers from the defense speaking, which is ridiculous. Again, he was just moaning. And so in any case, we come to, you know, a very swift end after we adjourned we recessed for about 10 minutes. And then, you know, suddenly the judge is like, okay, permission, so leave to appeal is granted. We'll have a full hearing in the future, and then, you know, you'll be able to hash out these arguments then. Because I know it's a bit confusing, because you might be thinking, well, what's the difference between the next appeal and this appeal? Yes, it is confusing, because you have to get permission to appeal, which you're basically just reiterating the same arguments in the full appeal, but in greater detail, because it will be longer, right? So this was just a 2-hour hearing, and it happened because the Americans presented assurances. The deadline was April 16th, and then Julian's team responded. The Americans responded. Basically, they're arguing with each other. Obviously, they're not happy. The Americans didn't provide any good assurances, and so the judges said, "Look, if you can't agree on something, or you don't provide assurances by April 16th, we will automatically grant Julian leave to appeal on these grounds." But then the Americans did end up submitting them, and the judges today said, "We don't like your assurances. We're going to have a full match. We're going to have a full appeal hearing in the future." And so, yes, of course, it's a win for Julian, but the guy is still in prison. He is still locked up in jail. You know, like, this guy's in a cell 23 hours a day. This is psychological, physical torture. It's absolutely vile that we treat journalists like this in the UK, and then we call ourselves civilized. I mean, I find this really repugnant. And what the Americans are doing here is the most grotesque attack on free speech and journalism on the face of the planet. Make no mistake, you don't just roll up and say, we want to put you in jail for 175 years. I mean, how dare you? Like, George Bush should be in prison. The people that committed these acts in the documents published by Assange should be in prison, not Julian Assange. And so I'll just end with that. It's a win. It's a small win, but a win nevertheless. And so the struggle continues. Free Julian Assange. And if you'd like to learn more about the case, please check out all the playlists I have. I've done, you know, every single one of these hearings and stints. I've been in the court remotely and in person, every stage of the case for the last 4 years, and done daily coverage and exposés about the entire process. And let me tell you, it's riddled with holes and corruption. And the Americans will do just about anything to snatch Julian out of our hands and then throw him in a dungeon, and we have to stop them.